Hello, hi, hello, and welcome. It might be hot outside where you are, but I hope you are bundled up. For today at Alta Live, we are going on a voyage to the Arctic. My name is Beth Spotswood. I am your host here at Alta Live. I am the digital editor of Alta Journal, and I am so excited to welcome author and journalist Julia Flynn Siler here to talk about her journey to the Arctic. She went there, as she wrote about in an article for Alta called Shivering at the Top of the World, to trace the footsteps of an Arctic explorer and Californian named Louise Arner Boyd. While there, Julie connected for us in this article that the relationship between the climate crisis that is so visibly apparent in the Arctic to the extreme weather we're experiencing here in California. So we're going to talk about that today. We're going to see some photos from her journey and answer your questions. A little bit about our guest. Julia Flynn Siler is a best-selling author and journalist. Her most recent book, The White Devil's Daughters, The Women Who Fought Slavery in San Francisco's Chinatown, was a New York Times Editor's Choice and finalist for a California Book Award. Her other books are Lost Kingdom, Hawaii's Last Queen, The Sugar Kings, and America's First Imperial Adventure, and The House of Mondavi, The Rise and Fall of an American Wine Dynasty, which was a finalist for a James Beard Award. A veteran journalist, Julie is a longtime contributor to and former staff writer for the Wall Street Journal and has been a guest commentator on PBS, BBC, CNBC, and CNN. She's also a frequent contributor to Alta. We are delighted to have her. Before, though, I dive into my convo with Julie, a little bit about Alta. Alta Journal is an award-winning quarterly focused on California and the West. We present this, we're big. If you don't know us, we're a big, beautiful magazine. We are also a website, free event series like this, Alta Live, which is every Wednesday. We also have the California Book Club, a monthly book series in which we interview a California author along with a special guest. These events are all free. You can support the work we do by joining Alta as a member for $50 a month. You get, or $50 a year. Sorry, $50 a year. You get 4 issues of Alta, a baseball hat, our book guide, our bookstore guide to bookstores of California and the West, or you can join us as a digital member for $3 a month. If you like what we do here, I so hope you will consider joining us. And certainly check out our work. There is a Q&A button at the bottom of the screen to ask questions for Julie. There's also a chat. I see people coming in from Lake Placid, Chester County, PA, Springfield, California, Oregon. It is so nice to see everyone. So ask your questions for Julie here. This will be recorded and posted to altaonline.com later today, as well as links to Julie's article, her books, anything else we talk about. With that, I am in Marin County, California. Julie, where are you today?
I am in Marin County, California, too.
Your Marin looks a little different than mine, actually, in the background there.
This is the Svalbard Peninsula. But yeah, no, I'm looking outside and it's very sunny and very warm outside.
It is. Although I see we have Daryl from Fairbanks, Alaska here, who has perhaps some legit coldness. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. So, Julie, we were chatting before we went live. I was rereading Shivering at the Top of the World last night and discussing it with my husband. Would we go on a 2-week voyage to and through the Arctic Circle? And our answer was no. Can you tell us what led you there? I guess we can start with Louise Arner Boyd and kind of go on from there. And as we talk, folks, I'm going to make this kind of hopefully visually exciting and share some images. So, Julie.
Sure. Thanks, Beth. So that's funny. Your husband and you wouldn't go on that trip. So I had stumbled across Louise Arner Boyd, who was a gold rush heiress, and by coincidence was a neighbor of mine. She lived about a mile away from where I grew up, and she was this extraordinary figure. And I came across her in a National Archives blog, and as it turned out, she really transformed herself. The photograph you're seeing here is when she was presented to the court of St. James in the 1920s. And she was, enormously glamorous during that roaring period of time. But she lost her entire family and inherited an enormous fortune and started following her childhood dream, which was to go to the Arctic. And specifically, she wanted to go to some of the same places that her childhood hero, Roald Amundsen, had gone to. Could you go to the next slide? And this is an extraordinary photograph taken of Louise in 1926. And her first voyage to the Arctic was a hunting expedition. She was there with her society friends, a Spanish count and countess, and they had stocked the ship with champagne and cigarettes. And in their journey, they killed something like 29 polar bears, which is so horrifying to our sensibilities today. We think of polar bears as being animals symbolic of, the climate changing in our midst. But that was really the last time she went on a hunting expedition. And her next trip, she devoted her ship and the captain and all of the crew to searching for her childhood hero, Roald Amundsen, who had gone missing in the late 20s at the top of the world. And she spent months prowling the Arctic seas looking for him. And there was an incredible change that happened. She stopped killing animals and she picked up a camera and she started photographing the Arctic and photographing its people and its animals and glaciers and glacier recession. And she started bringing scientists up to the Arctic Circle. Could you go to the next slide, Beth, please? And one of the papers of Louise Boyd are very close by. They're at the Marin Historical Society, and they've recently been organized. And one of the treasures in this collection is the bronze hood ornament of a polar bear that Louise had attached to her chauffeur-driven car. So she would tootle around the Bay Area with a polar bear on the front of her car, and she became very highly respected and the most preeminent 20th century woman Arctic explorer. And
was there a catalyst for this sudden change of heart, or perhaps, eye-opening experience that she had, that where she went from hunting polar bears to being really concerned about their survival?
I think that becoming part of a team, an international team that was hunting for Amundsen, that was looking and hoping to save him, was a pivotal moment in her life. And it was a serious mission. She was the expedition leader in charge of a ship and a group of men. And she was honored by the Norwegian government in her efforts, as well as the French government later on. So she was taken seriously as an explorer in Europe, to an extent more so than she was in the United States. And I think she realized that the Arctic was starting to change and that her life purpose was greater than simply killing animals, and that by documenting not only the changes in the Arctic, but also the enormous beauty of the Arctic, that she could make a meaningful contribution in her life. I think that's what it is. I'm still researching, so it's a quest for me. And so one of the reasons that I wanted to go up to the Arctic was I'd never been there, and I wanted to see some of the same things that she had seen and follow in her footsteps. And I had to figure out how to do it. I didn't want to go on a cruise ship with a bunch of tourists. And so I applied for a residency. Could you go to the next slide, Beth? And I was delighted to be accepted to this residency for artists and writers. In fact, I'm thrilled that a couple of my shipmates are on the call today. Daryl and Ira, I know, are here. And anyways, we're all accepted onto this boat journey at the beginning of the pandemic, and it was delayed for a couple of years. We couldn't go because essentially Norway was shut down. So we finally were scheduled to go in 2022. There was a little bit of a hitch because there had been a delay because of the pandemic of these classes of artists and writers. The organizers of this nonprofit decided to stack a few classes in the same year. And we were assigned the last journey in the late fall of 2022. And we left in mid-October. And for anybody who's a fan of Arctic literature, there's very few expeditions leave in the middle of October, or historically very few have done so because of the dangers of a ship getting trapped in ice and having to spend the winter in the midst of the Arctic wilderness. And so our ship, which you see here, it was called the Antigua, was not an icebreaker ship. It was a three-masted barkentine sailor, and it was equipped with a diesel engine. And we had a fantastic Dutch captain, and he was very, very cautious about how he was navigating the fjords and the peninsulas. But sure enough, we had a windstorm at one point, and the captain ended up wisely tucking the boat into the tip of the fjord, and we kind of sheltered where we were. But we had 18 hours of serious rocking. A lot of my shipmates got very, very seasick. It was pretty rugged. And afterwards, I have to say that our captain, Jonathan, confessed to us literally as we're leaving the boat. His words were something along the lines of, I was picturing doom when I thought about this journey. And
Jonathan.
I know. Yeah, thanks for telling us now, dude.
And so essentially, just to kind of recap here, you find yourself on this boat in the very late season in terms of traveling to this region, because you're kind of on this quest to follow, not necessarily to study climate change by any stretch, but because you are researching this kind of historical figure from California. You want to kind of follow in her footsteps and see where she went. And also I just want to, as we kind of get into climate change, you make a point in your article of stating that, historically, you wouldn't have even been able to leave this late, that scheduling a trip this late in the year would have been impossible before climate change. But sadly, it's warmer now, and so you can go.
It was possible. And in fact, the Svalbard had the warmest summer in its recorded history this summer before we left. And the melting and the warming is taking place much faster at the top of the world, and particularly in the Svalbard Peninsula, than it is in many other places. So yeah, it wouldn't have been possible a few decades earlier to go in mid-October like this. And I wanted also, Beth, to be on a ship, a wooden sailing ship, very similar to the ones that Louise Arner Boyd sailed in, because I was trying to write about the experience, and I needed to kind of feel it and sense it and take notes and just experience being on a ship. So there was a grander purpose as well, in terms of my ability to describe it by having myself live through it a little bit.
Your shipmates were all, for the most part, or the people who had also, been accepted into this residency, were artists and writers for the most part. What kind of work were they working on?
Oh, they were such a fabulous group of people. That's all I can say. And there were sculptors, there were audio artists, sound artists, who would, for example, drop microphones into the water to capture the sound of beluga whales. There was a wonderful Canadian Slovak musician who went out in a Zodiac, and I remember her wearing a dress, and she carried this long wind instrument and played songs to the glaciers. And I mean, there were so many interesting projects. And for somebody who, I live in words, and I spend most of my time in books and documents and archives, and to spend 2.5 weeks with people who think so differently than I do. It was quite a great experience.
I think I included one of who's this gentleman or
So this,
woman?
yeah, this is a German artist. She's a performance artist. And so we would have daily or twice daily landings. We get in the zodiacs and move from the ship to the land. And she brought this unusual kind of outfit and spears things and was recording what she was doing. And to me, it seemed a lot like the Swedish film director Ingmar Bergman's work, the kind of stark way that she had transformed herself against this landscape.
So you're on this boat within kind of an eclectic group of creatives, as well as a crew, I imagine, who know how to get you through this terrain. When did the reality of the intensity, I guess, of climate change start to make itself apparent to you in a surprising way?
Yeah, a couple things. I mean, there were windstorms 100 years ago, 2 years ago, 200. The windstorm probably wasn't that out of the ordinary, but the moment that it emotionally hit me was when the captain very slowly piloted the boat past a glacier, the Hornsun Glacier, which is a gorgeous glacier. And we were all standing on deck, or most of us were there, and we could hear the cracks every 5 minutes or so of the glacier breaking apart. And as soon as these sheets of ice would fall, these terns would dive into the water because the falling ice would churn up food material for them. And it was, at first it was shockingly interesting and orally it was so interesting the way that it sounded. And then it sunk in what this really meant, which was that these glaciers were retreating. And then I started to realize that the landscape that Louise Arner Boyd had seen 80 years ago or such, or about that amount of time, much of it was scree, much of it was rock, because there had been such retreat of the glaciers over that period of time. And that if you were to line up her photographs she took then with what that landscape is like now, they would be very different. Those two views would be very different. And so there were shipmates who we were all very unsettled by hearing the glacier retreat like that. Some of my shipmates ended up crying and going to their cabins. A lot of us felt sadness at different times during the journey. It was very melancholy, and I think that was partly also because the sunlight was disappearing. We were very close to what our expedition leader, Sarah, called the dark season, meaning that the sun was going to disappear entirely while we were on the ship. And it not only was visually unsettling for especially a Californian, but it was very emotionally unsettling as well to wake up to darkness, to go to bed to darkness. I was very disoriented towards the end of the trip, and I kind of guess that some of my fellow shipmates were too.
Can you touch upon, how one of the I think that the points that the article tried to make, and we can get into the polar bears that Louise had gone at first to hunt and then to admire and revere. And we kind of make the point that dwindling population is reflected in the weather we're seeing. But can you start to talk about that a little bit? And just in terms of when you talk about these, as you said, glaciers receding and breaking off and melting, make the correlation for us of how that thing that's happening thousands and thousands of miles away is directly impacting the extreme weather and wildfires, that all of the things that those of us on the West Coast and certainly around the world, but specific to the West Coast, are dealing with.
Absolutely. So before I went, I started becoming aware of scientific studies shortly before I left, there was a very good study out of Scripps in San Diego, tying the warming in the Arctic Circle to the extreme weather events that were happening in California. And last year, we had unbelievable rainfall in California. We had a lot of weird things happening that seemed way outside the extremes. Well, likewise, what's happening the far, far north is that the glaciers are melting, sea levels rising, and that's changing the atmospheric currents. And so there are cold streams going one direction and warm streams going another direction. This is way above my pay grade to actually explain this. I would send you links to the studies themselves, but it was very striking to realize how closely these two places were actually connected. And so I just started thinking more deeply about that. And, it may be a bit of a stretch, but it did seem kind of like a butterfly effect in the sense that, a small change in one place can produce a large change somewhere else. And as soon as I got home from this trip, my husband Charlie and I were digging out our drainage ditches because we were having a record rainfall in a 24-hour period where we were living, and it was kind of frightening, honestly. Extreme warmth in Svalbard and extreme rain in Northern California.
Did you, I realize I'm asking a question I know the answer to, end up seeing any polar bears?
We saw one polar bear. And woo, I love that photograph. This photograph was taken by my shipmate, Frankie Carino, who's a wonderful photographer based in LA. And so we're all on ship. It's around lunchtime or shortly after lunchtime, and the radios start crackling. And our 4 expedition guides, who were always armed with rifles whenever we left the ship, they realized that there was a lone male polar bear walking along the glacier, kind of in a lagoon area, not far from where our ship was anchored. And so one of the ship's mates, a man named Matu, climbed to the crow's nest, and he got his binoculars out, and he could follow the polar bear as it made its progress. And the expedition leaders decided that they would try to get us in the zodiacs so that we could get closer to the bear. And we all did that. And it was extraordinary. It was really something to see him. For one thing, polar bears are a lot yellower than I'd always expected. I expected their fur to be white, and maybe that's a bit foolish on my part, but anyways, kind of yellow. They're very graceful. And one of the things that a number of my shipmates pointed out was that at one point the bear stopped and seemed to be doing yoga poses. It was very playful. It lay down on his back. It's rolled around. It did like downward dog for a while. And it was unforgettable experience to see that polar bear.
Did you
Yes.
feel any Louise Boyd kind of connection to this creature in particular?
Well, yes, because I could see why she made the decision to stop killing them, because they're very beautiful. And it gave me a lot of joy to think that bear continuing to move on its way after we had taken a lot of photographs and watched it, and that the bears are now protected in Svalbard. So
is it rare to see a polar bear on one of these expeditions? Did people used to see significantly more polar bears? Tell us a little bit about just the polar bear population and the likelihood if you are seeing any bears at all.
Sure. Yeah, there's no guarantee you're going to see a polar bear on an expedition. And certainly a lot of the cruise companies and the expedition companies, they implicitly promise that you'll see one with their marketing materials and the visual kind of see a polar bear. But there's no guarantee that you'll see them. That said, with the ice melting in the Arctic Circle, the bear's habitat is declining, and their hunting grounds are declining. And so what's been happening around the town of Longyearbyen, which is the northernmost settlement in the world, and it's in Svalbard, is that there's a greater concentration of polar bears around that town. There's an estimated 300 polar bears living around there now. And there's more likely to be human interaction with polar bears because they are losing their food sources. So things are changing for polar bears right now. And I think what was extraordinary about our experience was that we saw the bear without a lot of other ships around. In the middle of the summer, there would be ships 10 deep looking at this single polar bear, but it was just us. So
you got to have an intimate experience with I imagine the way that Louise Arner Boyd did when she was on her expeditions, of just kind of being a lone expedition out there. Before I wrap this up, our heroine of the day, she is. It looks like kind of overall, you talk a little bit about the melancholy of realizing how these glaciers are impacting, to your point, the butterfly effect of climate change around the world, and the extreme conditions that we're seeing here in California and beyond. But this was clearly a once in a lifetime experience. Would you go again?
Absolutely. So literally the day I got off that ship, I emailed another ship captain I'd met and said, could I started, my begging letter, could I please join your expedition to the Arctic Circle next year? And so I'm continuing that effort to try to figure out a way to get back up there. And I realized there's a very heavy carbon cost for doing this. But I'd really like to go back up. So in that sense, I'm following Louise's footsteps, and that it's a fascinating place. And I hope I get the chance to do it again.
I hope you get the chance also. What was most surprising to you? I'm sure you expected to be impacted, overwhelmed by the climate change, the melting of the glaciers. But what was a real shock, if anything?
Well, our expedition leader, Sarah, had shared with us a book by a local writer in the town of Longyearbyen. And Longyearbyen has had a terrible series of weather-related tragedies happen, including just landslides that destroyed homes and killed people, and related to wet weather or warming weather. And I guess a surprise for me was reading that book and visiting Longyearbyen and thinking more deeply about, these are really people who are living in the most extreme petri dish for climate change on the planet, probably, or one of the most. And to think a little bit about what that felt like for those people, especially the writer was raising children. And I also have to say that COVID hit our ship. And there's a larger issue about that. Our expedition leader, it hit our ship within 48 hours. The expedition leader said, COVID is here, and there's really absolutely nothing that we could do about it. We were all too interconnected. And of course, that's a metaphor for the way that we're all interconnected in terms of warming in the Arctic Circle and torrential rains in California or drought in California. We're all connected. So that was, that it brought me a lot of sorrow to see some of my shipmates get sick. And thankfully everybody recovered. But that was almost to be expected, but sobering nonetheless.
That's an amazing connection, though, that how many people total were on this ship?
About 40 in total. So there were about 29 artists and writers, and then there were about 10 either folks involved with the expedition or crew and captain.
But the connection to COVID, if one person, impacts the whole, it hasn't, and there's nothing we can do. We're all part of the same planet, and we're all ostensibly on the same team. Is there, when you came home, was having seen this kind of separate from your work researching as a historian and as an author, did you feel an urgency to suddenly, I don't know, buy a hybrid car or, make some real big changes in your personal life as it relates to climate change?
Well, we have hybrid cars. So yeah, I mean, it made me more determined to try to write about the experience in a way that maybe might move other people or touch other people in some way. And it's been so astonishing to see what some of my shipmates have done with the experience. And I'm sure I'll see even more as time goes on. But one of our shipmates was a BBC filmmaker slash radio producer, and she did this amazing radio documentary that really captured the melancholy nature of the experience that we had in the Arctic Circle. So that was incredible. So I guess I came back with more of a focus on storytelling, and can I take what I've learned over these decades as a storyteller and try to move people and share with them the experience that I've had with either the Arctic Circle or with climate change. So I'm kind of staying in my lane. Like, can I be a good storyteller? That's my goal.
If history is any indication, you're a fantastic storyteller. Deborah asks you, can you name again the ship and the organization that sponsored your residency?
Absolutely. It's called thearcticcircle.org. It's got a gorgeous website. And it's a juried residency program, so you have to apply for it. And the ship was called the Antigua, and I think it was a Netherlands ship, maybe. I'm not quite sure, but you can track that down easily.
Christy asks, what inspires you to invest the time to write a book? Is it personal experience with the subject, longtime interest, popular interest? Is it, the cool thing to write about? How do you decide?
Yeah, I mean, I'm very focused on places that are interesting to me. And in the case of Louise Boyd in the Arctic, I, like everybody else, had been in lockdown for several years, and I stumbled across Louise's story, and I was yearning for an adventure of my own. And my books are kind of adventures. I wrote about the Napa Valley and the House of Mandavi, and I spent a lot of time in the Napa Valley. I got to spend a lot of time in Hawaii for Lost Kingdom, and Chinatown for The White Devil's Daughters. And so I love exploring new places and asking questions about them.
Christy also asks, did you meet any native indigenous peoples in your travels?
Great question. In Svalbard, there are no indigenous people who live there, which is kind of shocking.
Why?
But it was truly a wilderness area until the early 20th century, when trappers started coming to it. There are other places such as Greenland, which is also in the Arctic Circle, where there's a very vibrant indigenous Inuit population, but in Svalbard, there's not.
Kevin's coming in with a tough one here. If you could say one or two sentences to climate change deniers,
Oh,
what would you say to them? I mean,
yeah, great question, Kevin. I don't see how you can live in this world and be a denier at this point. I mean, what explains the torrential rains that we had in November and December and January, if not a change in climate? So I don't know. There's many smarter people in the world who could come up with a better answer than I can come up with. But thank you for asking.
And Kevin, I hope that you're not a climate change denier, but I would suggest consulting a doctor and just getting checked out, because obviously there's climate change. Martine, now that you've seen climate change from afar, are you reflecting or noticing more changes due to climate change in your local environment? For example, she grew up in the Bay Area, and the puddles used to freeze over regularly in the winter, but they haven't anymore. Do you see more of these little changes? Or, I mean, of course, there are gigantic changes. Our homes are burning down, but the little things, do you notice more since your trip?
Absolutely. I love that question. I think the most mournful sign that I've seen in the last month or so was driving up to Tahoe, and what's going on with the forests there, these dying forests. And partly it's the beetle, bark beetle infestation, partly it's many years of drought before we had last year's wet year. But it's shocking what's going on. And more closer to home, I don't see as many butterflies as when I was growing up. And I love them. So
yeah, I know the loss of the butterflies is heartbreaking. Ira, from your trip, points out in the chat, which I think is amazing, the navigational maps being used on the boat showed us on the glacier, even though you were actually in the water. That is how quickly the landscape is changing. They had you as being on a glacier that had no longer there since the navigational map was created. That's heartbreaking.
I didn't even know that, Ira. That's incredibly interesting.
Thanks, Ira, coming in with the intel. Julie, we have gone over time. You are the nicest, most interesting, agreeable, amenable guest ever. You always come with such a great perspective and a lot of wisdom. I'm so grateful to you for all of your work in Alta, but especially this article. So thank you. You can find it in this issue of Alta. We're gonna email you all a link to that article. Julie's other work in Alta, including A Horrible Death to Die, one of my absolute faves, about the murder of Jane Stanford. So check that out as well. We're going to send you a link to, I think we can find a link of how you could apply for this residency also. We'll dig that up and send it to you for anyone interested in that, as well as an invitation to join us next week, where we welcome Peaches Christ. And we're going to talk about an interactive horror theatrical experience that is coming to San Francisco this next month. So join that. We're kind of going to take a arts and culture flip next week and discuss that. So please do join us if you're interested. Again, Julia Flynn Siler, amazing author, journalist, and friend of Alta. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Beth.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.